Tonight, we're going to be talking a little about what we believe. And this all kind of came out of a place for me of a quote that I heard several years ago that's kind of stuck in my mind. And it's this: what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And so if we think about that for a minute, I don't know what comes into your mind. When I was a kid, would picture what God must look like. And as a kid, you picture like an old guy with a big beard, or at least I did, old guy with a big beard, very wise, sitting on a throne when you would see some of those kingly kind of passages. You have lots of different things. I remember the first time I went into the fellowship room of a Church of Christ building. On the wall there in the fellowship room was this painting, and you've probably seen this somewhere along the way, of a guy who is praying over a loaf of bread. And I thought, maybe that's him. This is kind of what I had pictured in my mind of what he must be like. But to go beyond just the physical ways you may picture into what you imagine when you think of God, the kind of feelings that come with that, the kind of beliefs that come about because of your thought about God. And so what this leads us to is the idea that there are things that we believe that change how we live. And we've talked about this concept in several different places, but I want to kind of center in here tonight. You come to believe something and it changes what you do. And so in the morning, one of the first things my wife will ask me is, do you know what the weather's supposed to be like today? And so I will go to my phone and I will pull up the weather app and I will tell her, and there is a magical temperature in her mind that will make her decide whether it is a long sleeve or short sleeve day. I still don't, after 24 years, I don't know what that number is. But I know there are some things I can say and she'll come out with short sleeves on, and some things I'll say she comes out with long sleeves on, because her belief is this is where that line is. And we have lots of things like that in life. I think spiritually we have the same stuff, where what we believe will affect what it is that we do. So tonight we're going to talk about 3 beliefs that change how we live. And we will talk as long as my voice will hold out. If it is short, it's not because there's a football game on tonight. It's just because my voice has had enough, but we'll just see how far we go. So first of all, what we believe about God changes how we interact. And as I was thinking about this, one of the places I came in my mind is to the Israelites coming out of Egypt. I'm doing a daily Bible reading plan this year, and where I happen to be in the last several weeks is in the Exodus. And so that has been kind of top of mind. And what I've seen about the Israelites is what they believe about God seems to impact a lot of what they do. And I get annoyed with them when they do it, and probably pretty patient with myself when I do it, but I see a lot of the same kind of things. So think for a minute about the Israelites. They are out there, they have been freed, they are making their way toward the Red Sea. Egypt is pressing down on them, and they feel like here we are in the middle of kind of a rock and a hard place, and we don't know what to do. And this is their reaction in Exodus 14 and verse 11. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? So they've been freed from slavery. They are moving toward the promised land. They don't understand that yet. And yet their question here is, well, did you just bring us out here to die? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Do we not sometimes get there too, where we feel like the things that are going on for us when it comes to our walk with God don't seem as good as some other option that is out there? And so we begin to convince ourselves that something about God is not what we thought he would be, and because of that, maybe we know a better way. Or we find them a couple chapters down the road in chapter 16, they're hungry. And when we get hungry, we don't always make good decisions, and we're not always focused on the right things. And it says that the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. In many years as a youth minister, I was often responsible for feeding the teenagers. And I found that when the teenagers were hungry and they knew that the food was coming and that I was the thing standing between them and the food, sometimes they would begin to grumble. And I understood Moses a lot during those times of what he must have felt like. And then they say, would that we died by the hand of the Lord in Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out of this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now, as we read this from afar, none of it makes sense, does it? We look at this and we know where the story is going to go and how it's going to end, and we think about these people. Why do you not see the bigger picture? And yet, because of their hunger and because of things not going how they think they should go, they find themselves struggling. And then later within the story, we find Moses going up on the mountain to get the 10 Commandments. And while all of these laws are coming down to him, and as you read that section, you've got the 10 we're incredibly familiar with, and then a lot more instruction, a lot more law that's going on. And he's up there for quite a while. And you find yourself thinking, as you're down at the foot of the mountain, all right, is he coming back? What's going on? They begin to lose faith and lose sight of what's going on. And in chapter 32, verse 1, it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said to him, up, make us gods who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him. And so then in the rest of the chapter, we find them getting all their gold together and melting it down. And you'll notice a little detail in the midst of that story, putting it into a mold. So there's a lot of planning that has gone on here, and making this creation of a golden calf for them to bow down and worship. And at each level, where they get more and more impatient and lose more and more sight of God, it seems to make less and less sense, doesn't it? But in the midst of their daily grind, they are not recognizing who God is and what He's doing. And for us, it's all a different set of circumstances, and we're not gathering to melt down gold and bow down to something, but are we not finding things where we lose sight of what God's doing? Or maybe try to replace God with something else that we feel like will bring us happiness or fulfillment or whatever it is. That is the world in which we live. And at each sense of this, we find God answering their question in the midst of what's going on. If you look back to chapter 14, when they're a little worried about Egypt pressing in on them and the sea that's before them, Moses said to them, fear not, stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you only have to be silent. So even though what you see is the army behind you and the sea in front of you, there is a God who is with you and fighting for you. And then when they find themselves hungry in chapter 16, the response is this. The Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. So you think you're hungry. I'm going to show you something you've never seen before. It's going to rain bread from heaven. I'm going to provide for you what you need. Or when they're up on the mountain, when Moses is on the mountain and they're down below and they don't know what to do, God is angry. And God is ready to be done with them and strike them away, or at least that's the way it's introduced to us. And then Moses says to God, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven. And all this land that I have promised I will give to your offspring, and they shall inherit it forever. God had made a promise. God had made a covenant with His people. And throughout all of their struggles and all of their ups and downs, He is going to stand by His people. He is the God who does that. So we believe that God is faithful. And if we do that, it should change how we see things. So when things aren't going well, when we feel like we're pressed between the army and the sea, or we feel like we're hungry and don't have the things that we need, or we feel like we can't see what God is doing, and we don't see His presence, He is still there, we just don't see Him, because He is faithful. And if we're able to begin to shoot through things through that lens instead, then we will begin to operate in a different way than how we see things now. So we believe what we believe about our God is important, but secondly, what we believe about ourselves is important. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of up and down with this. There are days where I feel kind of okay about myself and feel like I'm in a good spot. There are other days where I feel very unworthy and unskilled and unequipped or unmotivated or whatever it may be. And I think to myself, there would be anybody else out there that could do whatever this is in a better way. And again, I find myself drawn to Exodus because that is what we see in Moses. You see a little bit of that idea in the bulletin this week. But as we see Moses being called by God in Exodus chapter 3, it says that the Lord turned aside to see. God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. So there's this burning bush that Moses sees. He goes over to see what's going on. God calls to him. And then he said, do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So Moses understands who God is. What we just talked about, who God is, what we understand, what we believe about God. Moses gets that piece of it. But he begins to lose sight when it is, how do I fit in to that? And so God comes to Moses with this plan. I want to free my people Israel from Egypt, which sounds like a great idea until Moses learns, I want you to be the guy who leads this. And that's not something he's quite as interested in. And so he says in chapter 3 and verse 10, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? And we have probably felt this way in one place or another, where we've been tasked with something and we've thought to ourselves, who am I to do this? This is not a job for me. Or further in verse 13, Moses said to God, well, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And then he continues making excuses. Moses answered down in chapter 4 and verse 1, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. Or further in chapter 4 and verse 10, Moses said to the Lord, oh my Lord, I'm not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. And then finally in verse 13 he said, oh Lord, please send someone else. So you see Moses called to do this thing and God kind of walking him through it all along the way. And he says, I'm not good enough. No one's going to listen to me. No one's going to believe me. I don't have the skills. And then when all of that fails and God has a response to all of those things, he said, well, somebody else must be a better choice for this. And we have probably all felt this way somewhere along the way. We've thought to ourselves, if I were to pick anyone out for whatever this is, it would be someone that's not me. I'm not the right person for this. And what God sees in us is something that we don't see in ourselves oftentimes. He sees what can be, but the key to it is it's not what can be because of how great you and I are. It's what can be because of how great He is. So his responses to Moses throughout this, in chapter 3 and verse 12, he says, I will be with you. I will be with you, and this shall be your sign that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. In verse 18, he says, they will listen to your voice. God says, I will be with you, and when you think they won't listen, they will listen to you. And let me explain to you why. Or in chapter 4 and verse 12, he says, go, I will be your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. If you think you're not a good enough speaker, I will teach you the words that you need to know, and then you will be able to relay this to them. Or maybe in a New Testament way of thinking of it, what Paul writes in Romans 8 and verse 31, if God is for us, who can be against us? And this is the message he keeps giving to Moses over and over and over again. And we lose sight so easily because Moses seems like this giant of faith to us, that Moses was, when he encounters God at the burning bush, a guy who was on the run. A guy who wanted to forget his past life and move on with something different. A guy who felt like his best days were probably behind him. And yet God comes to him with something different. God sees something in us that we don't always see in ourselves. So we believe that God is with us. And this changes completely how we look at ourselves. Because when you think to yourself, I'm not good enough, well, God would argue with that. You are good enough because God is with you. When you think to yourself, there's someone who could do this better, well, maybe in a worldly sense, there may be some truth to that. But when God is with you and has tasked you with something to do for Him, you are exactly who He has in mind to do that thing. And so God wants us to see ourselves the way He sees us, in a way that is worthy because He has made us worthy. And then third, what we believe about others changes everything about how we live and what we do. And there are a lot of different places we could go. I don't want to overuse this, but I think it's a good place to kind of set the course for tonight. We've talked on Wednesday evenings quite a bit about the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. And I want us to be reminded of how the Pharisee sees himself and how he sees other people. In Luke 18, verses 11 and 12, the Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. So he sees himself in a very high place. He sees this tax collector in a very low place. And if we're not careful, we can fall into this trap from time to time, where we see ourselves in one way and we see others in a very different way. And what we learn in Scripture is Jesus does not see people that way at all. In Matthew 15, before he feeds the crowd, it says in verse 32 that Jesus called the disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. You ever around a group of people that compassion is not the first thing that comes to your mind? I've been in this situation so many times where I was thinking just the other day, when David was a little bit smaller, he and I went to the Senior Bowl in Mobile. We went down there to watch the game, and the way that stadium is situated in Mobile, it's in kind of the bad part of town. And you can just park wherever you can find parking. And so everyone who lives in that part of town during Senior Bowl weekend, their house becomes a parking lot. And they're out charging whatever they can charge for parking and all of that. And you just have to walk through this sea of people, through kind of an unsafe part of town, to try to get to the game and get away from the game. I don't know that I've ever held my child's hand as tightly as I did walking through that crowd of people. And I will tell you, I was having all kinds of thoughts about this crowd of people and what may happen and concerns and all of that. I don't know that compassion was at the top of my list. Or maybe you've been at Walmart recently and you have found yourself with people who don't understand they're in your way. I had one of these yesterday in Walmart where I thought to myself, here we are again. And compassion doesn't always rise to the top of the list. And yet Jesus has this crowd who has acted irresponsibly and not planned for their meal that day. And his first thought is compassion. In John 8, story we looked at last week, the woman who is caught in adultery, where all of the religious leaders who are there view this woman as a prop in their scheme to trap Jesus. They don't care about her. They don't care about her plight. They're assuming she's going to be dead by the end of the story. And what we see is Jesus instead having compassion on her. And after everyone has dispersed, realizing there is no good answer to the question that Jesus has asked, it says that Jesus stood up and said to her, Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? Isn't it interesting that this is the first time we see anyone speak to her in the story? She's arguably the main character in the story. No one has talked to her until this moment. Where are they? And she said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said, Neither do I condemn you. From now on, go, and from now on, sin no more. So what does he want from her? He wants her to change. He wants her to live a different life. But he doesn't reach that through condemnation. He reaches that through love for her. Or the story we looked at this morning. Jesus heals this blind man that everyone's looking at, trying to figure out who to blame and what went wrong. And even after the healing, when he is cast out by the religious leaders, Jesus pops up again in verse 35 of chapter 9, and he says, Do you believe in the Son of Man? But before he says this, notice the way it's described. And having found him, he said. How many stories does Jesus tell about things that are lost and people seeking them out? Jesus talks about the 100 sheep and 99 are safe and one is gone. And the master is going to seek out that one. Or the son who is lost, or the coin, or treasures, all these different things. And here we find Jesus, not in a parable, but in real life, actually doing it. He is seeking out this man. He's now found him and begins to have a conversation with him about spiritual things. In John chapter 11, Lazarus has died. Jesus shows up. He knows what's about to happen, as do we do, that he's going to be raised. But in the midst of that short verse in verse 35, Jesus wept, and the Jews who were there said, See how he loved him. Jesus showed compassion. He sought people out. He loved people. In Mark chapter 10, they're bringing children to Jesus. And so many people, especially in that day and time, viewed children as just kind of a nuisance. I would like to think that we have moved past that as a society. And then I see people on social media complain about the kid on an airplane or at the table next to them in a restaurant or somewhere being in the way or whatever it may be. And even in church life, sometimes you will hear people who complain about kids being loud or things like that. I feel very blessed. I've not heard those complaints here at Southwest. I love the fact that we have the kids that we have, and occasionally there's the noise that we have that comes with that. It's part of life. But Jesus, when they're trying to shoo the kids away, it says when Jesus saw it, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God." So the people who were viewed as lesser in his day and time, Jesus says, bring them on. Bring them to me. Or later in the chapter, a rich young ruler has come and asked Jesus these questions about the important commandments. And Jesus has listed off several to him. And he says in verse 20 and 21, "Teacher, all these I have kept from my youth." And Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said to him, "You lack one thing. Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." So this guy who was pretty sure he knew all the right answers and did know a lot of the right answers, when Jesus knew there was something that was lacking, he didn't look at him with an "I told you so." He didn't look at him with impatience. And you think of how many times if we were to say, one thing you lack, there's one thing you're missing, is it preceded with what Jesus does? He looked at him and he loved him. And that's how Jesus saw people. I would love to read that parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and seeing the Pharisee look at the tax collector and think, it must be really hard for him to be here. He's so much unlike these other people who are in this place trying to serve God. These people don't like him because of what he has done to them socially, and he's probably robbed from a lot of these people, and he's got to feel so out of place. I wonder what his life is like. What if he looked at him and tried to understand his plight? But instead, he was just all about who he was and who he assumed the other person to be. And Jesus is none of those things. So we believe that all people are valued by God, and because of that, they should be loved by us. And yes, that really does mean all people. So if there is someone in your mind that you think to yourself, this person is really hard to love, they should very quickly move to number 1 on your list. Or if there's a group of people that comes to mind and you think, these people are really hard to love, I'm not asking you to agree with them. I'm not asking you to excuse the things they do that you know are wrong. I'm not asking you to fully accept behaviors that you know are ungodly. I'm not asking any of those things. And Jesus didn't do any of those things either, by the way. But what he did was he saw them, he had compassion on them, and above all else, he loved them. And so what we believe changes everything about what we do. What we believe about God changes how we see both the good and the bad. When blessings come our way, we can see the work of God much more clearly, probably. But even when challenges and suffering and difficulties come our way, can we begin to ask the question of, how can God be seen here? What can I learn about God from this? How can I show God to those around me through this? Because we know he is faithful. We don't want to be the Israelites who assume, now that we've been freed, that we're about to die. We want to assume instead, now that we've been freed, God has something in mind for this. And what is God doing here? What we believe about ourselves changes how we see the world and how we operate. So as we understand that God views us as people who are capable of being part of his mission, then let's be part of his mission. Let's work for him, do for him, be the people he has designed us to be. And then third, what we believe about others changes everything about how we see the world around us and how we see those people that are frustrating to us and difficult to love and who are in the way sometimes and who we're impatient with and who are just difficult to be around. We can see those people the way Jesus saw them, not as interruptions, but as people, not as difficulties, but as people, people designed by God, valued by God, and who God wants to have a relationship with, and who we can play a role in that entire process. So today, if you look at yourself and you think to yourself, well, I kind of struggled doing a lot of those things, I don't think it starts with the doing of those things. It starts with what we believe. Do you really believe that God is who he is and will do what he says he's going to do? Because if you do, it changes everything. Do you believe that God has equipped you for good works that he's designed in advance for you to do, as he tells us in Ephesians chapter 2? If you do believe that, then we got to start looking for the good works and doing them. Do you believe that God really loves people the way we see Jesus people loving people when he's on the earth? And I think clearly he does, because Jesus is such a great example of that. And above all, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. God loves the people who are in this room and the people who are outside this room and wants them all to come close to him. If you don't have a relationship with him tonight, you can be baptized into him and you can begin this walk that changes your beliefs and the way you see the world. Or if you have found yourself moving away from that and maybe what you believe has not been consistent with your actions, you can come back to him and make that change in your life too. If there's some way we can help you tonight, please come while we stand and sing.